Welcome to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is an investigation of everything from a very British perspective by two brothers who consider themselves to be relatively reasonable sort of fellows, and we do this one topic at a time. We are Jeffrey Campos, an engineer and devil's advocate, Benjamin De Campos, designer and believer. We generally choose a topic of interest, or a topic that we think we need to know more about. We spend a very small amount of time researching it, we have a discussion, and then we publish the notes. We do this because we believe that fostering a greater understanding of the world before we die is probably a good idea and a really good way to spend your time while you're on the planet, and hopefully will prompt further thought and discussion from our listeners. The topic we're tackling today is going to be podcasts and podcasting. Podcasting, as a broadcast medium, has now firmly established itself as an advertising channel amenable by all product categories. No greater validation exists for the confirmation of a new method to draw in a crowd of potential consumers than to have paying sponsors vying for the most compelling players in the market. Podcasts, syndication mechanisms, listening hardware, and the pervasive behemoth that is the internet is the ecosystem in which personal broadcasting has taken off and is threatening traditional sources by outreaching them in terms of convenience, niche, and hardware support. Are we headed to a better informed, more meritocratic future where everyone wields a microphone with intent? We're certainly not going to be talking about Jovian genocide and escapements and complications. I think we should start off with the history of podcasting. It seems to have been around for forever. Do you remember the beginning?
Yes, I remember when podcasts first became a thing. I remember thinking that it sounds like something that isn't very good, something you had to download, and it was at a time where there wasn't the ubiquity of high-speed internet. And iPods were dumb and couldn't connect to the internets. It seemed like a crazy chore and something that wasn't convenient at all. As I mentioned to you before, I saw podcasting become popular out of necessity, as Apple had refused to feature radio on their iPods. So those of us who like listening to people speaking instead of music had podcasts as the only alternative.
I automatically assumed it was an Apple thing when it first came out, and well, at least when I first heard the term. I mean, I'm sure I was downloading audio files before the name podcast arose. But when I did hear it, I assumed it was an Apple sort of technology or some new means to download audio files from the internet. And I've read information to the contrary that podcasting it's not even inspired by the iPod, as you would automatically assume. I kind of think it is, but I found contradicting information on the internet, where I did most of my research for this show. But I assume that the pod in podcast is indeed an homage to the iPod, which was not super mega popular when it first arrived, I seem to remember, but then gained popularity, meteorically. It became super popular and ubiquitous, but I think initially it was people a little bit hesitant about it. I mean, I certainly had MP3 players with hard drives in them before the iPod came along, but the iPod certainly did make everything a little bit easier. And of course, it didn't have a radio, so as you said earlier, perhaps that spurred on the adoption and popularity of podcasts. But indeed, a podcast it's a computer file. It's a file that that contains audio content that you can read using a suitable bit of hardware and a software program. Originally, and I think the iPod came out in late 2001, so you would download a podcast to your Mac originally, and then you would need to transfer that podcast to your iPod. Podcasting wasn't built into iTunes. You had to have a separate standalone so-called podcatcher program in order to download the files, or you could just download audio files using a browser. But I think the chief benefit of podcasting, certainly very early on, was the integration of syndication tools. So you would be alerted if there was a fresh bit of audio to grab, and then you could just download it and put it on your Your player of choice. I think podcasting is very popular. It has always been very popular, but I think not as popular as other modes of personal broadcasting. I get the feeling that YouTube has been a lot more popular than podcasting in general. Even though YouTube is just one place on the internet, I think there are far more YouTubers out there than there are podcasters. I think there are millions of YouTubers, and I think it's a few 100,000 podcasts that are available. So it's a massive difference. Producing audio content versus producing YouTube content, I think it's a vast difference. Not necessarily in appeal, but certainly in scale. I found a little bit of information on the Pew Research data website about a website called Libsyn. Libsyn, I've never heard of them, but apparently they're one of the largest podcast hosting companies out there. And they recorded 2.6 billion podcast downloads last year, 2014. 63% were from mobile devices. So, up from 43% on mobile devices in 2012. So increasingly, people are downloading podcasts to their mobile phones, which makes a lot of sense. Whether or not the people who have always had mobile phones are turning away from their PCs to their mobile phones to download, or it's just the massive adoption of mobile phones that has led to the increase of downloads to them. Because I think a lot of the people, a lot of mobile phone users around the world actually do not have a primary PC. They just have a mobile phone with a data connection. That's all they have. And if they use any computer, it'll be through the data connection of the mobile phone anyway. I think that accounts for a vast amount of the computer users. I just wanted to mention also with podcasting, there are patent trolls out there. These are companies who own patents or patents, I don't know how you want to pronounce it these days, on the technology that is used to produce and disseminate these podcasts. And the biggest one is the Personal Audio LLC, and this is a patent which states an audio program and message distribution system in which a host system organizes and transmits program segments to client subscriber locations. What that gobbledygook means is that if you try and produce a podcast, this company, Personal Audio LLC, will come after you and charge you a license fee that you have to pay. Otherwise, they'll take you to court. And this is still happening. And the more popular podcast programs out there and podcasters are being sued by Personal Audio LLC. But apparently there's a glimmer of hope on the horizon, and maybe there'll be a breakthrough and that we won't have to sort of look over our shoulders every time we sing the Happy Birthday song.
What is this? So anyone who creates a podcast?
Yes. Podcast, like MP3, it's not an open format. It's not open source. If you are recording audio into a computer file and disseminating it to persons unknown to yourself as a broadcast, then you're infringing copyright 6,199,076 by Personal Audio LLC, a very famous patent troll. So you always have that fear in the back of your mind if you ever get too popular.
Well, I don't understand. So what part of what we're doing is illegal?
Well, we're recording audio and making it available to people we do not know on the internet. They're able to download that program and play it on their little devices. That is an infringement on this patent. So many, many shows have been sued. This company will go, it's a Texas-based patent troll. I don't know what the actual term for patent troll is. I've forgotten. But they will send you notifications just to say, you seem to be very popular. Guess what? You need to pay us a license fee. If you pay us $5,000 a year, we'll allow you to continue doing what you're doing. But if you don't pay whatever the fee is, we will see you in court. And that's what they do. But some big names in the podcasting world have been fighting against them.
Well, and they asked for $5,000.
Well, I don't know how much they're asking for, but they'll certainly ask you to pay them a fee.
Right.
because you're contravening the restrictions of their patent. Simple as that. But I think Adam Carolla, who's an extremely popular podcaster out there and stand-up comedian, I believe, he's taking a stand, and he's appealing to his audience and the audiences of other podcasters. And he's saying, look, we need to squash this bug. Just like the Happy Birthday song.
How the hell was that allowed then? I mean, you might as well just, like, I don't know, people singing aloud. You might have someone wanting money for that. I don't see how this is an enforceable thing.
Well, it's similar to the Wikipedia is now has set up an appeal against the right of panorama, I think. And that's if you take a photograph of a friend in a square in a popular city, and there are buildings in the background. Some of those buildings are copywritten buildings, and you're not allowed to take photographs of them because they are edifices or artistic structures, or they are privately owned entities that you cannot take a photograph of and then upload onto the internet. You can take a photograph for your own personal amusement, but you cannot use that photograph in any kind of exhibition on the web, like a website, or just uploading the photograph or having it as a backdrop, or you can't do that. So Wikipedia is fighting this.
Yeah, I can understand the Happy Birthday publishers wanting royalties every time someone uses the Happy Birthday song. Someone wrote that, and that's the way it works. That's fine. But to create a podcast with original content and release it to iTunes, it just sounds complete insanity that there's an organization that can somehow charge your ass for that.
Well, it's sort of like the MP3 copyrights. So, MP3 seems to be the de facto standard for audio transmission across the internet. But in fact, MP3 is not an open source format. It's not like Ogg Vorbis. It is a copyright that's held by the manufacturers, the people who invented the medium. And yet it's been used as though it is free and open source, and you don't have to pay a penny to anyone. You do. You have to pay those licenses.
Actually, I think there's a way. I mean, that is a different situation, because I think everyone can get away with using MP3 because everyone probably has an Apple product, and they almost certainly will pay the MP3 people. They'll pay them off. So that fine. But I need to. Look
fine
into
for
this
you
more.
maybe, but as a Linux user, it's tricky for me because the operating systems I download for free don't pay those licenses because it's a free operating system. Where would they get the money from? So they've had to negotiate in lots of interesting ways in order to get those codecs available in their operating systems. But more things to maneuver around. And this is the importance of open source and open standards. It's unfortunate that you can go a long way down the road before you realize that you may be stepping on toes. But at the same time, it's in the interests of the copyright holders to let you travel far down the road before they spring out of the bushes and say, ha, guess what? You've been walking down a private path for the last 6 miles. Now pay my toll as you cross the bridge. So there we are on the sort of legal standpoint. And there are other legalities and legal issues. If you use companies that host your podcasts, then you need to be extra careful on the content, not just whether or not the content is inflammatory in any way or offensive or illegal, but also you need to be aware of the facts of ownership. If you host your audio files on some servers, they own your audio content, and they may even prefix your audio with a disclaimer saying, all the views that are expressed herein are not necessarily the views shared by the hosting company, etc. So you have to be careful who actually owns the content of your own podcasts. It completely depends on who has physical control of the medium, distributes it for you. So another sort of little legal consideration. But I think we should move on to the the type and the technique of podcasts and what are they exactly? I mean, all we've said really is that it's an audio file that is free to download. Well, not necessarily free to download, but can be downloaded and played on most computer systems, including mobile phones and PCs and whatnot. But what are they? I mean, I have a list of podcasts that I listen to, and I would explain them as niche topics. So discussion programs and interview programs, book review programs, programs that are specific to scientific topics or cultural topics. And they're serialized. So a podcast is something that you regularly consume, like the episodes of a television program. It's no different, really. I mean, there are very few podcasts out there that are one-hit wonders. I don't ever remember listening to only one podcast from on any particular topic. Usually they are serialized, and they have there are different techniques used. There are different formats. Some are interview style. Some are just one person talking into a microphone in a sort of a lecture kind of format. There are a lot of call-in podcasts, which are quite good. So you'll have a panel, and they'll take calls. So it'll be very much like a broadcast show. And there are a lot of sort of passive podcasts. That is, podcasts that comment or critique current events in whatever field of interest they occupy. So I find those sorts of podcasts very common, whereas the panel style programs less so, and just one person speaking to a microphone, quite rare. I rarely find just one person speaking into a microphone these days. It always seems to be an interview sort of style or panel. But I listen mostly to interview style podcasts, I believe. One person talking to another person about a book or a particular topic. What is your experience with the different types of podcasts?
Well, as I put in the show notes, it seems to me that there's two types of podcasts. There's those which are podcasts from the ground up, and then there's those which are from traditional radio broadcasters, and it's the podcast edition of their shows. So looking through my list of podcasts on my phone, I did see that maybe most of them are actually from a radio show. Like, for example, the 5 Live film program, which is a radio program, but I listen to at my convenience on the podcast. So the first few years of listening to podcasts were typically that. And it was only relatively recently that I started discovering podcasters like what we spoke about, Dan Harris, etc. In fact, contrary to what you were saying, I do have situations where I only listen to one episode from a particular podcaster because it happens to feature someone that I like. And I won't want to subscribe to those podcasts,
I know what I meant is a podcaster who only ever produces one podcast, as in one show, and that's it.
I see.
They're there, then they're gone. I've never inadvertently or accidentally listened to that podcaster's one show, and then they disappear.
Right.
Whenever I find a new podcast to listen to, if it's quite good, I'll subscribe, and then the next one will come along, and I'll listen to that one, and then maybe the next one, and if it survives 5, then they're really superb. And but unfortunately, most of the time, I never get through 5 shows. Is it a show, or is it an episode, or should it have its own jargon? I'm never quite sure. They all seem to call it something different. I hear a lot of shows, I hear a lot of episodes, I hear a lot of programs. I
think they are episodes. I actually don't listen to them as often as I used to because I find, this is a separate point, but I'm finding that how Apple and iTunes treats podcasts really irritating. It seems to be really, really buggy or something. There's something going on with the iPhone 6. iTunes, and a Mac, which is not jiving with me at the moment. And I'm finding podcasts to be a bit of a chore. Sorry, this is a bit of a technical and nothing to do with the programs themselves.
I was just going to say that there's a very popular pod-catching program for the Mac at the moment that seems to be garnering quite a lot of plaudits, and that's Overcast. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
What seems to happen is I plug my phone in, and all my podcasts then populate. And it's like, okay, that's great. I don't want all of those podcasts on my phone, so I'll go and delete some of them. And then I'll put all the settings as to don't automatically sync when I plug my phone in. I plug my phone in, and then it clogs it up with 50 million podcasts again when I've asked it not to.
When you say you plug your phone in, what do you mean? Do you plug your phone into a computer?
Yes.
Right. I didn't think anybody did that any longer. I thought one of the reasons why podcasts it seems to be experiencing some sort of resurgence at the moment is because we now have the bandwidth to get podcasts directly to mobile phones. And I think for a while there, people just couldn't be bothered to go through the hassle of connecting their phone to their computer and mounting it and then syncing and all that kind of thing. Now, the cloud handles all of that, and you just download everything directly over the air to your mobile, and you never plug your mobile into anything except to charge. So I think you're quite rare in that respect. I don't believe that many people do that. One of the reasons why podcasting is most podcasts are going directly to phones these days is not only because of the increase in bandwidth, but also that previously there was no way to record a show. I mean, for a long time, there has not been a very convenient way to record a radio program that's being broadcast live and then getting that recording and then playing it on something, especially a mobile phone. That's not easy. Recording radio is incredibly difficult. We no longer have cassette tapes. I remember when I'm listening to a radio program and it's really good, and I just press record on the tape that's in the tape deck, and then once the program is finished, I can take the tape out, put it in a Walkman, and then I'm walking around listening to that radio program at my leisure. That to me was listen again. And then tapes died, and then there was no way really to do that until we had the bandwidth and the mobile phones. So suddenly it's back. Listening again is back, and it's called podcasting. But before it was, DIY taping from normal traditional broadcast medium. But then recording just sort of died. I mean, recording to VHS tapes, and that was huge once. But then it died out, and nobody recorded anything anymore. And now, of course, you don't need to record anything anymore because everything's always available, forever on the internet. I think that's one of the big reasons why it's so popular now. But plugging your mobile phone into a computer, I didn't think that was necessary. I thought iTunes synced everything in the clouds. Not being a Mac user, I assume that was how it worked.
I'm sure a lot of people still plug their phones in. And for a number of reasons, I still plug my phone in. One of which is the sad reality that the iPhone 6 battery just doesn't last very long. It's unbelievable that in 2015, the iPhone barely lasts a day. So I always, if I'm, I work on a computer all day and I'll plug my phone into it. So it's charging while I work. I guess I could plug it into like a socket on the wall, but it's more convenient to plug it into the computer. But there's still plenty of reasons why you would plug your phone into the computer and mess around with iTunes. It's like I still have quite a large library of music that I like to copy over to my phone to listen to. And the easiest way to do that would be to plug it into my computer. I mean, I could store 20 gigabytes of my music files into the cloud, but that sounds like a chore. Plus, I don't have an iCloud account. It's confusingly complicated to set one up. So, yeah, but I actually don't plug my phone in to my computer that often anymore, simply because iTunes...
You're inundated with... podcast episodes you don't want.
It is just insane. There's like 3 areas of iTunes and on the phone where you can tick a box that say, don't sync. And I'm guessing it must be a situation where if you tick one, that sort of overrides the other, so you have to find out where it all starts. But it's just infuriating. It's like, I want to get rid of all of these podcasts, but I don't want to unsubscribe. I just don't want to have them on my phone because I've only got 16 gigabytes on my phone. Plug my phone in, and then bing, the little tape gauge at the bottom of iTunes suddenly maxes out. And it's like I have to go through again and delete all the stuff I don't want to listen to, and then tell it, don't do that again. Next time I plug my phone in, maxes out again. So, thanks, Apple.
That does sound infuriating. I think it is quite complicated. The programs that I use, what they actually do is quite sophisticated. You know, you can leave off listening to a podcast at any time. I have a queue of programs in my subscription lineup, and I can just click on any file, and it'll start playing from the beginning, or it will resume if I had been listening to it previously. Then if I tire of listening to that particular episode, I'll click on a completely different podcast episode, and it'll again resume from where I left off on that one. So it's sort of like a Kindle with multiple books. You can skip between the books and you never lose your place. So that's all very clever. And then there's the in the queue of each podcaster, we have staleness. So, you know, how many unlistened podcast episodes do you want sitting in your queue for any one particular podcast? You know, my maximum is 3. Once I've hit 3 unlistened or partially listened to episodes in one podcast, it'll just start chopping them off at the end. So, you know, I will start missing podcasts. So it's good in that if I have subscribed to a particularly prolific podcaster, that podcaster won't take over my entire listening budget. So I'm never listening to anything else because he's just drowning me with new content all the time. So, you know, they're quite complicated, these programs. They do quite a good job. I think they're quite buggy. I've never had a podcast program that I was completely happy with. There's always little, you know, gotchas and flaws in the logic and the programming. But I think they're getting a heck of a lot better. I haven't used iTunes for a very long time for podcasts, but I do have an iPhone, so I may give it a go just to see whether or not it's gotten any better. But you know, the podcasts, they're getting larger and larger. The file sizes are getting much larger. I mean, typically, and they're long. Podcasts are always quite long, you know, over an hour, usually, all the podcasts that I listen to. I guess it's because there's no constraints. They can be as long as they want. It's quite liberating. We should talk about how they differ from normal broadcast medium, but we'll get there. So, you know, if I have 50 podcasts sitting on my mobile phone and each one is over 100 megabytes, you know, it's a considerable chunk out of your storage space. So you have to be wary of that. And as you've discovered, you can easily become inundated to the point where you're drowning and you no longer have any space on your phone. So these things do happen, all down to the fabulous technology of RSS, which I think we should talk about. This is the other part of podcasting. The serialization and episodic nature of podcasting is an XML format that describes every episode as an individual discrete item. So your podcatcher program reads the XML file for each podcast to check to see if there's a new item. If there's a new item, it reads off the information for that particular podcast, reads off the file size and the duration, and then, depending on your configuration of the program, downloads that file to your device. So RSS is this XML-based means of intelligent dissemination of the podcast programs. And that's very powerful and very clever. And it's open source and open standards, so there's no licensing issue or legal nightmares to get involved in there. But basically, that's the conveyor belt that is bringing you the podcasts. So in the traditional broadcast world, you have the Radio Times. You have guides that will tell you what's on and when the next episode is going to be. And you can set your video or whatever technology you have in order to remind you that a show is coming. or you have a much more of a push notification format of RSS, which stands for really simple syndication for the latest version, version 2. But before that, it was rich site summary and RDF site summary, which I didn't know. That was the older versions of the standard. But now it's really simple syndication. That's the conveyor belt that is bringing the content to you. And RSS is agnostic when it comes to the actual file. It doesn't care. It could be video. It could be video podcasts or vodcasts, I think they're clumsily called. Or it could just be articles on a website. It could be anything. It's anything that's serialized that you would like to let people know is new and available through a common interface, the XML file. Very interesting, I think, RSS, and super powerful, really old, and used for loads of things. But it's as if manufacturers and software designers out there don't want to talk about RSS. It's like they want to talk about the magic. They play up their own technologies, but they're always based on RSS. And it's like the power of these core agreed methodologies is just goes underappreciated. HTML is underappreciated. CSS underappreciated. RSS underappreciated. More people should know more about these technologies, I think. About the file types, do you your podcasts that you have, are they ever anything other than MP3?
No, I don't think they are. I think they're always MP3s.
Does Apple give you an AAC format or something?
Yeah, it does, because when I do the mastering of the podcast that you and I record, when I export from the podcast feature setting in GarageBand, it then gives me the options of how I could export it. And the default is this crazy Apple format, which I think I did send you one time. And I think you kind of balked at it, saying, what the hell file format is this? And then I reverted to MP3. But I think the sort of that Apple standard podcast also can include like cover art and huge summary of information and stuff like that. So I'm assuming people use that. I've not personally seen that, and I'm pretty sure all the podcasts that come into my iPhone are all MP3s.
Yes, likewise. Only MP3s I've ever noticed in my podcast queue. I'd be interested if there are any others, and if there was an Ogg Vorbis format available. I don't know. I'd give it a go. But MP3 all the way. Just jumping back to what you were saying earlier about the two basic types of podcast. One is from the ground up, a podcast that is built as a podcast and is sent out onto the internet to be consumed as a podcast. And then podcasts that are just mainstream broadcaster programs packaged as a podcast to make it convenient to listen again. So I was a very early adopter of the BBC's Listen Again program. So they had lots and lots of episodes that you could just download as files, a variety of files, I believe, in the beginning. And you can listen again as individual files in your little media player before there were any podcatchers. And I think they had that going on a lot longer ago than I think a lot of other mainstream broadcasters. I think they were quite innovative on that front, making their programs available, which was always preferable. I mean, I remember setting an alarm to make sure I listened to a live broadcast on the radio, which seems completely insane now. I absolutely would not do that. It's far too tedious and requires far too much effort, and I'm simply not willing to put it. Whereas with podcasts, the main strain is to find podcasts and to find, especially when navigating websites, where do I go to download the file? And finding good podcasts, that's always difficult. There doesn't seem to be any really good listings pages out there on the internet that gives you a definitive breakdown and search facility and filters and all the rest of it that I've found that has been compelling in the slightest. I know iTunes does a lot to try and put in listening figures and charts and all the rest of it.
iTunes is generally quite good with looking for podcast content. It's quite a reasonably clear interface, and it makes the experience bearable. It's still not great. It might be to do with me just being slightly dumb. I'm not sure, but there is something kind of, well, this doesn't make sense about using iTunes, and just like basic stuff as well. Like Apple's supposed to be amazing at design, but when you do a search for iTunes for podcast content inside of iTunes, and it gives you this list in like a grid format with columns. You can't adjust like the columns, so all of the podcast names are typically truncated, and you can't sort of like extend the width of the column to read what the hell the title is.
Bizarre.
And this is like
that's
now.
basic functionality.
Exactly. And I think I tweeted about this saying, Apple, you're supposed to be such, so brilliant at design. So it's not perfect, but I think generally speaking, it's quite good, and I'm pretty sure it's comprehensive. Like I think all podcasts on Earth need to go through iTunes. So it's good for finding everything, and plus I think it's good if you know what you're looking for. It's easy to find stuff. So the experience is generally good on iTunes. I've not experienced any of the other podcasts you mentioned, podcatchers you mentioned, though I have looked into it. When I was going absolutely insane with iTunes not doing what I wanted it to do, I did look for an alternative to iTunes on a Mac that I could use, and I couldn't find a single one. Also, I just want to say another reason for why I'd plug my phone into the Mac is so I could use a large screen to navigate around and look at my podcast and view things and choose things and select things. And I just don't like doing it on the small screen of my iPhone.
I just wonder if that's a tech generational issue that you have, which I share. If I'm ever near a desktop computer or even a laptop computer, I would just instantaneously put the phone down and do whatever I was doing on a computer. It's the last resort to do anything on my phone. But I know people, and I have seen people who seem to prefer to use their little handheld device or tablet device over using a desktop. And this is one of those sea changes that has happened, which it baffles me. And I just think, this massive seismic shift must have occurred in other areas as well. And it could well be podcasts and the consumption of, or the consumption of audio on the move, commuters, perhaps. Perhaps commuters who were heavy music listeners during their commute have now shifted over to podcasts and spoken word. So maybe just listening to music is diminishing, and listening to spoken word is increasing. I'm sure there are no numbers for that sort of thing. I mean, it's obviously very difficult to try and quantify the listenerships of podcasting in general, if you consider it as an industry. I mean, how many times does the same person download the same podcast? Do people who download podcasts actually listen to them? Are podcatcher programs actually sending data back to give an indication on what has been listened to and what has not been listened to? It's one of those sort of TV detector van situations where you just don't really know what people are listening to.
I don't think it is at all. I think, well, just going back to the first thing you said, yes, I think it's a generation thing. How the younger generations seem to not have a problem with navigating around a small screen, whereas you and I would instinctively want as much real estate as possible. But going back to the TV detector van analogy, I think it must be a lot easier to track stuff when you're doing things digitally like this than it would have been, say, in the days with analog TV and radio. It's like, how would a radio station know what people are listening to? And the answer to that is they'd send out questionnaires to people. And who the hell fills out questionnaires? And who the hell's going to say, oh, yeah, on Sunday I listened to 15 minutes of this radio program? They wouldn't. But I think you can get to that very high resolution detail with digital content. I don't know whether or not people send stuff back to Mother, but it can't be that difficult to do things anonymously.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, the most reliable data you could have on whether or not people are actually listening to the content is advertising. How many people are buying the products that are advertised in the show? How many people are typing in using the codes that were given out during the shows? That's a definite indicator of interest in programs. And whenever I listen to any program that I'm really enjoying, I immediately buy all of the products that the podcasters are endorsing. I just run out there and buy them cash. I don't care what it is. Which leads us nicely into monetization.
Yes.
So podcasting, I mean, it is disruptive in the sense that it does get to places that traditional broadcasting does not, like the underground. In terms of audio, it is broader in its appeal, in that you can find seriously niche shows, just by nature of the scale of it. And now that it's having this resurgence, this seeming resurgence, I'm not sure if there is one there, but judging by the numbers, it does look as though downloads of podcasts are increasing significantly, and the advertisers are interested. So almost all of the podcasts that I listen to have advertising in them, and the advertisements take different shapes and forms. And it doesn't necessarily have to, I mean, there's always funding involved, but it doesn't necessarily have to be through advertising. It could be through donations. So quite a lot of podcasts I listen to, the presenters will ask for donations, or ask to have their podcast advertised by you, the listener. So, write endorsements, write reviews, tell your friends, let's get popularity up. So donations, donating in other ways that are not monetary necessarily, and advertising. I don't know if you've noticed the advertisements in the podcast that you listen to, but are they a bit samey? Do the same sponsors pop up again and again and again?
There's certainly not any advertising in the BBC podcasts, but typically in the non-BBC podcasts, there'll be a different kind of advertisement than we're used to. It's like if you ever listen to commercial radio, there's these bizarre breaks every 10 minutes or so where they play like 5 ads in a row. And that I've never heard on a podcast. Podcasts I've listened to, generally they start off with saying, this podcast is sponsored by Audible. And then, about a minute going on about how great they are, and then another minute telling you how you should, go to audible.com and pay for their services, which is fine. I find that far more bearable. And I find that they generally are the sort of the beginning and end cap of a podcast, which means they're easy to not listen to. You could spin past the first couple of minutes of a podcast, get into the meat, and then when you get to near the end of the podcast, and he said, "Well, thank you. Before we go," then you can stop listening.
How are you spinning past? Are you using the little visual scrubber on your phone?
Yeah.
Is that easy? Because it just isn't. It's not high enough resolution to actually accurately get to the end of the ad.
It's quite good on an iPhone because you can if you hardly move your finger at all, then you can choose very fine increments of time. But if you're quite clumsy, then it'll be big. But I actually say that I'm actually pretty conflicted about skipping past ads, because this is completely free content. And I realize that there's still a way to go for podcasters to actually earn money out of this stuff. And so when Sam Harris at his podcast, he says, if you enjoyed this podcast, maybe think about donating. Who knows? Maybe I will.
Well, if it becomes easy enough to donate, I mean, if it's as easy as a wooden box right in front of you with a little coin slot on the top, I mean, I would donate. If I'm listening to a program, I would put, 20 pence in the little slot in the top of the box. No problem. But it needs to be that convenient. I don't want to have to go anywhere and read out my credit card details or, do any sort of transaction over the internet as a one-off. That's quite painful. If there's a very easy way to do it, then I think everybody would probably pay a few pennies.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, it needs to be easy. It needs to be a no-brainer. In a similar way that streaming music services that we've discussed, once you have a streaming music service that's so good and has absolutely everything, and you're paying a subscription fee for monthly, that effectively stops you from needing or wanting to steal music in terms of downloading things illegally. You just don't need to. That problem has gone away. You have everything that you could possibly want for an easy, paid for in an easy way for a reasonable amount of money. That's got to be the way to go. So, we need some sort of easy payment plan like that for podcasting. But then also a lot of the time when I'm listening to podcasts, I think, do you really need to make a living out of this? I mean, do you really need this to be funded? I mean, why can't this just be your hobby? Why does money have to enter into it all the time? It's not that expensive to host or to record or do. It doesn't take that much time. I mean, really? So I question whether or not most of the podcasters who I listen to actually really need to have any money from me.
What?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty controversial for you to say that.
Do you think?
Yeah.
We don't ask for any money.
That's different.
This is completely free, and we don't bother anybody about advertising at all. Although I have to say, this show is currently sponsored by Audible, and Audible are the producers of over 200,000 audiobooks with very high quality.
You shouldn't say that because it's not.
I know it isn't at all. I was joking. But these are the advertisements that I hear on the podcast that I listen to. And I have an issue with them because the more popular that the podcasts I listen to get, the more advertising spots in the program they sell. And they sell to quite a variety of advertisers. Although quite often the same advertisers I hear on a lot of the different podcasts that I listen to, which are not all the same genre. But they endorse the products in a way in which they want you to believe they endorse the product. What I mean by that is they would never try to sell you anything from an advertiser if they didn't truly, truly believe in the product. So they spend most of the time trying to convince you that they really, really, really love the product. They really love... is it Hank's Razors? I forget what it is, but it's some razor blade company that make, safety razors. So they make safety razors, right? Nobody could be passionate over almost disposable safety cartridge razors. But so many of the podcasters I've listened to just really want you to believe that they love this product so much. They'll never go to any other face shaving technology again because they found the ultimate face shaving technology. And this happens again and again and again. They really, really, really try and convince you that Hover is the best possible DNS host, or some bedding company really do make absolutely fabulous mattresses, and all
Casper.
Casper, that's the one. I'm clearly.
What's the problem with this?
These products are baked into my mind. The problem I have with it is that the podcasters I listen to, they go to extraordinary lengths to convince you that they truly believe in these products. It's not enough just to read out the advertisement. They really give you personal anecdotes and stories. And is that really necessary? It's like there's some sort of competition to get these advertisers. They're not just going to the advertisers and saying, look, I get these figures. This is how many downloads we've had of this program. This is my influence in the sector. How about advertising on my show? They'll also say, and I will really bend over backwards to convince people to buy your products by personally endorsing it. I'm really going to sleep on your bed and eat your cereal and, put goo in my hair because I want people to believe that I believe in your product. To me, that just seems insincere. I just think if these...
Well, that's cynicism on your part,
but
I think.
If podcasters didn't need advertisers, they wouldn't want advertisers. If they didn't have advertisers, they would probably slag off advertisers and other programs when they hear them. I don't think anybody likes to listen to an advertisement.
You see what you just said there? You said if podcasters didn't need advertising, then they wouldn't have advertising. Whereas a few moments ago, you said, "Do they really need advertisers?"
No, I don't think I just said that. I said if podcasters didn't need, I mean, they needed money, right? But they were getting funded in some other way, so they didn't have to have advertisements in their programs. I don't think they would like advertisements in their programs. I don't think they like advertisements in their programs. If they didn't have to have them, they wouldn't have them. That's what I'm trying to say.
Of course they wouldn't.
Of course they wouldn't. So it's a necessary evil, I guess. Because
But
no one
the
likes them.
problem
I
is.
don't like advertisements. I don't want to listen to advertisements. It's a waste of my time. It wastes my time to listen to advertisements.
But the alternative is you actually pay for what you're listening to. You going to do that?
Yeah, I might.
But until then,
Yeah, but until then, I'll just have to struggle through the advertisements. But what I'm
Exactly.
saying is if there were an easy way to pay for these podcasts, then yeah, I'd probably want to buy the podcasts and not have to bother with the advertisements. I don't care about the advertisements. I'm never going to buy their products. I don't care. Unless it's a really, 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 really good product that they're advertising. It just so happens that I was looking for exactly that service or whatever it is, and perhaps an endorsement from this guy who I respect. Okay, there are edge cases, and it's never happened, but I suppose it could happen. But I just think, just read out the advertisement or give that little space to the ad. I don't mind that. I understand that if you do need to be paid for this content that you're putting out there, not whether or not you've ascertained that you deserve to be paid for the content that you're putting out there. That's a separate argument. Then I'll choke my way through it. But otherwise, I never ever want to hear it. And if I do have to hear advertisements, I much prefer it at the top and the bottom of the show. I like this episode is sponsored by Blardy Blar. Please go and buy Blardy Blar's products, and then here's the podcast. Great. I think that's great. And at the end, that's fine. I'll even listen to the advertisement at the very end.
I've only heard a podcast where they advertise at the beginning and at the end.
Oh,
But
right.
also, I mean, I've never heard them in the middle of the show. I'm sure they exist. But also,
all
think
of the
what
podcasts I listen to do that.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I've not heard those.
Mm-hmm.
But think of what the alternative is. As I said earlier, it's these 5 ads in a row, say, of voiceovers and unfunny jokes and all this kind
Yeah,
of stuff.
commercial
I quite
radio.
like it.
That's
when-
commercial radio.
Yeah, exactly. I don't like that. And I much prefer to hear the broadcaster, who I like and trust because I'm listening to his show and I've subscribed to it, for him to tell me that he uses these products. And I don't have a problem with any insincerity. I think it sounds pretty sincere with the people who've endorsed products that I've listened to. Like Sam Harris, when he talks about Audible, he'll give a reason that sounds pretty good to me about why Audible is this company that I should give money to. And I think that's great. It's like a personal touch. So I think you and I just disagree about the nature of advertising in podcasts.
Well, I don't know about the nature, but I just don't like advertisements in podcasts. That's the long and the short of it. I just don't like
No
it.
one likes them. Yeah, if they could not be there, great. But also I realize that I'm getting this stuff for free, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, but again, I mean, the whole free thing. I mean, the production costs for podcasting is extremely low. And I think, do you really need to be paid?
No, it's
You know,
not.
you-
It's
you-
not.
Because it's the difference between people who think
You're
they have
wrong,
something
though.
to say and they want to tell the world about it, right? People who say, look, I have really interesting information here, which I think will benefit people. This is really good stuff. Let me get it out there. And then you have people who say, I think I can charge for this stuff. I'm going to try and think of something to say that I could charge for because this is a money-making scheme that I've hit upon, and I want to try and make money out of it. That's the two fundamental philosophies that are coming into the broadcasting world. And I like the people who say, you know what, I'm just, if you want to give me some money, just donate to me. If you really like what I'm doing, send me some cash. But I really believe in what I'm saying, and I think there's meaning and value in what I'm saying. So if you think there's value in what I'm saying, send me some money. I don't mind that so much. The value for value approach, I think, is a good approach. But the ads and any advertiser could come along, and as long as they pay the money for the spot, what you're gonna have to kind of think to yourself as a podcaster: should I turn them down because I don't really like their product, or I could probably get to like their product, or I'm going to pretend I like their product. I mean, you have all those questions going on. So, anyway, I think the problem is my end. I'm willing to admit that.
I don't agree with you that besides the material cost, podcasts are free to produce. For example, if Sam Harris spends a day crafting content for his podcast, there's a clear opportunity cost there. He could have spent that time doing something that would definitely earn him money. I don't know what he does as a day job. Maybe he teaches, who knows? But I don't know. But by that metric, it's not free.
Well, let me put it like this. Let's say I have this show, and I think it's really good. And I'll explain to you what the show is about, but I'm not going to give you the show. I'm going to say, look, do you think this is a good idea? I think it's going to be really good. Why don't you give me $5 and you can buy one of the shows? There you go. Versus I give you the show, you listen to it or consume the whole thing, and then I say, hey, you just listened to my show. You should really pay me for that. And it's like, hang on a minute. You're giving it away for free, and you're trying to guilt me into giving you money? Isn't that the wrong way around? If you think you're valuable and you think you're worth something, well then get that paywall right up at the beginning and say, if you want my content, you have to pay for it. Don't get me hooked first on free drugs and then start charging for the harder stuff.
I think that's a flawed argument. I mean, I don't think every broadcaster has such a pristine artistic integrity as that. Things have to be worthwhile to do. And if they do make all this effort and get nothing in return, apart from the satisfaction of making people happy, that might not be enough for some people. And they might want to have some kind of tangible returns for all their effort. So I think it's not unreasonable to expect for them to get paid.
I don't think it's unreasonable. If people think their product is valuable in monetary terms, yeah, they should try selling it. If they don't sell any of whatever it is they have, well then the value of their product is communicated to them in no uncertain terms. If I think I make the best lemonade in the world, and I put all that lemonade out on a table in the front yard, and no one buys it, well then my lemonade has no value in the market. But if I give my lemonade away for free, and then ask people after they have consumed my lemonade, you should really have paid for that. I hope you feel bad about that. It just strikes me as an odd way to do it. Similarly, when you go to the cinema, you pay before you've seen the movie. I think, halfway through the movie, you should be allowed to leave having not paid anything because you were suckered into that movie in the first place. But that's a one-off cost. With podcasting, because it's episodic, you pay for the first episode. If you really like it, you pay for the next episode. If you really like that one, you can pay less and get more in a standard costing framework that we're used to with everything. So I can see some kind of community, some sort of Netflix style framework building where you can micro pay podcasters as part of a subscription deal, a larger subscription deal. And I think that may take the pressure off podcasters to find advertisers. It'll remove the cynicism from people like me who think, you're always beholden to your advertisers a little bit more than you think. And it may influence the way you speak about certain topics, owing to the fact that your paymasters may have a vested interest and all of that sort of thing. So I just think, funding is a problem, but it's a problem that can be solved. Just like downloading music was a problem, illegally was a problem, but streaming services is beginning to solve So, we can wait for that sort of thing, but I think it will come. But again, the long and short of it, I don't like advertisements. Moving on, popularity. Do you know anybody who listens to podcasts?
Yeah, I think everyone I know listens to podcasts.
Yeah, I think I know a lot of people who listen to them as well, and sometimes they can even be water cooler discussions in the office. One example of this was a podcast called Serial,
Oh, yes.
which was just all about cold cases, which was wildly popular there for a few minutes. And there have been lots of very interesting interview podcasts, especially in book review podcasts. But I think all of my favorites are, as you say, just amenable radio programs, mostly from the BBC. I think they're absolutely fantastic. And again, there are no advertisements, so even better. I think they're always well worth a listen. So what's the future of podcasting? Is it really disruptive to the point that broadcasting is just simply going to disappear into them, and program makers will simply either feed subscription models like Netflix, entire finished series of programs, or do you think standard broadcasters will simply take over podcasting as a delivery mechanism and just run down the smaller podcasters to the point where they're just subsumed, just like news is disappearing into Twitter, it would seem? What is the future of podcasting? Is it going to disappear? Is this a fad?
No, I don't think it is. I think, I don't know. Who knows? I doubt it'll disappear. It seems like it's thriving. And it certainly seems more popular than maybe I realize. Just because the sheer amount of podcasting there is. And you mentioned earlier, in fact, the beginning of the show, about YouTube being somehow a competitor of sorts. And I'm not sure that's true, really. I think they're two different beasts. I think podcast is a completely different type of craft.
Just in terms, I drew that comparison simply in terms of personal broadcasting. There are more personal broadcasters using YouTube as a medium than podcasting as a whole.
Thing I was saying at the beginning of the show is podcasts only really have kind of limited usability for me, because I like to actually listen to radio for reals, because I like to actually hear what's going on in real time. And podcasts is just don't do that. It's just, by their very definition, they're pre-recorded. And so there isn't that immediacy that you get with radio. So I think radio, even though it's probably in its death knell, will still have a future of sorts. And I can't see podcasts completely taking over.
Well, I can. Many podcasts already do. Many podcasts have a live stream during recording, and then the subsequent audio is made available for download. So a really interesting interactive point in favor of podcasts is that during the live streaming, there will also be a chat room. So you can interact. So there's almost a live studio audience who can actually, so I'll often listen to podcasts, a panel style podcast, where they'll struggle to remember a fact or anything, and someone in the chat room will come through with the answer and then tell them there live while they're recording the audio, which I think is pretty good. I like the idea of actually participating in the audience of a live podcast, and then subsequently listening to it to see how you sounded.
It's not a live podcast. It's an MP3 you download. I mean, sure, there's an audience of people contributing to the show as it was happening. I mean, it's live for them, but not for you, because you've downloaded it as a podcast. You're not listening to it live.
No, you are. There are podcasts. You go along to the podcast's website. They'll say the next show will air at 9 p.m. UTC. Join the chat room, and you go along to the website, and you can watch or listen by various streaming technologies. Participate in the chat room, which might be a Java chat room on the web page. It might be an IRC channel.
On your phone?
Not on your phone.
It doesn't sound like a podcast
It's
to
a
me.
stream, like you watch a movie on Netflix. You're downloading the audio.
Yeah, it's not a podcast though. You're not downloading something to your phone.
Yeah, you can stream it to your iPhone. You can stream it. You're downloading a file. It's streaming.
I think streaming falls outside the parameters of what a podcast is.
I deny that, because you have here's the scenario. You have a panel of people who are sitting around a table.
Okay.
You are listening to them record the podcast. So it's slightly meta, right? So you're listening to the recording live, and this produces a file that you can listen to at a later date. But
Exactly.
You can listen
It's
to
not
these
a
people
podcast.
speaking with their mouths live. They're creating the podcast. So you're
That's the
participating in the creation of a
podcast.
podcast. Yeah.
No. I'm right, because the show that they produce is what you download in your iPhone, and then that's not a live broadcast. The broadcast has already happened. You're listening to an MP3 file. If you want to participate in the actual recording of the show, then that isn't a podcast. You're just participating in some live streaming event.
Well, okay. All right. I mean, you're being pedantic, I think.
I'm not.
But it's part
I'm
of
not
the,
being pedantic. It's a detail that's crucial to the definition of a podcast.
Well, if you want to stick, if you define a podcast as necessarily a bit of audio of a previous recording, then okay. A podcast is synonymous with an audio file. That's fine. But your initial point was that you cannot listen to the content live. You can listen to the content live. If you want to say, well, that content at that point that is being broadcast isn't a podcast yet, then yes, I agree, it isn't. But you are listening to the live recording and the creation of that podcast, and you are able to participate to a limited extent, which I think, quite a large extent, which I think is quite interesting. But I think the technology is going to make all of this a little easier and more ubiquitous, and I think crazy, mad things are coming in terms of time dilation in podcast recording. But I think the future is bright for podcasting, and I'm a big fan, and it's most of what I listen to now, much to the detriment of my general music listening, which I barely listen to music at all anymore. It's a terrible thing, and I keep trying to make time for it, but I simply don't have the time. But unless you have anything else to add, I think we should wrap up. You have been listening to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is a podcast. We have a supporting website, eclecticist.co.uk, where you can pop along and download the audio of all of our shows. You can also have a look at the notes, which we also post. And if you have any suggestions for future shows or any general feedback, there's a form at the bottom of the page. Just fill it in, pop it along. We'll have a look at it and reply to you. We haven't decided what our next topic will be, so it's a great time to pop along to the feedback page and give us some suggestions. Unfortunately, this time round, we don't have any outro music of choice.
Yes, we do.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, I might as well. It's something I've been listening to recently. It's a bit of Beethoven. It's the first movement, the first part of the Pathetic Sonata Suite, which I'm sure I can find some public domain Beethoven. So I'll chuck that on. It's a beautiful piece of music.
Well, there we are. Who doesn't like Beethoven? It's the perfect thing to anything on. Well, thank you very much, and good evening.